Boa tarde. Então, bem-vindos e bem-vindas aqui ao seminário com o professor Fred Mosley. Tá? Vai falar um pouquinho sobre a trajetória de pesquisador dele. Tá? O evento está sendo aqui, está patrocinado pelo programa de pós-graduação em Economia da URGS e o programa de pós-graduação em Economia da PUC também. Temos aqui o professor Adalmir, né, e o professor Ricardo Datem, que contribuíram bastante para que o evento fosse possível. Tá? Então, o professor Mosley vai falar aí por volta de 1 hora e 15. Tá? Ele vai apresentar em inglês, né? E depois nós podemos abrir para questões. Tá? Então, quem tiver conforto pode fazer a pergunta em inglês, ou então pode fazer em português, a gente traduz aqui para o professor Mosley. Ok?
Okay. I guess I'll have to stand up.
So be careful because they are, transmitting.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Marcelo. I'm very happy to be here and to see, especially so many young people. It's great to have young people interested in Marx and critical economics, because you are the future. This gives some hope. So I originally planned to talk today on my recent book, Money and Totality, a macro-monetary interpretation of Marxist logic in capital, and end of the transformation problem. But Marcelo suggested that maybe that was a little too specialized, and suggested that instead I talk more about kind of my research in general. That will include the recent book, but also touch on other subjects that I've worked on as well. And in a sense, I think what I'll try to do is kind of trace my career as a Marxist economist in the United States. And this will bring up a number of topics, and then you can choose what you want to discuss further. So I guess I'll start with my interest in Marx really began and grew out of my political activity. As a college student in the 1960s, that was, of course, a very important time in the United States, a great time to be in college. So I'm sure many of you have similar experiences. Your interest in Marx growing out of political activity. I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement. And I graduated from college in 1968, which was a kind of momentous year, not because I graduated, but for lots of other reasons. And then I majored in math in college, and I became a high school teacher. Of mathematics in San Francisco and later in Boston, but I was also fairly actively engaged in these social movements, and as a result of that, I became more and more interested in the economics, and ultimately in Marx, as people around me were suggesting that we needed to study Marx. And so, like so many other people around the world, and no doubt in Brazil as well, we formed a capital study group to start to read for ourselves, and with whatever help we could get, the 3 volumes of Capital. This was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the early 70s by this time. And we, through various connections and conferences, we were able to discover that living in Cambridge also at the time was Paul Maddock. I don't know if you've run across that name yet. He's not that well known outside of the United States. He's actually a German, but he immigrated to the U.S. and spent most of his life in the United States. And he wrote a very important book published in the 1960s called Marx and Keynes, which I highly recommend. The subtitle of that book is The Limits of the Mixed Economy. One could say The Limits of Keynesian Economics, or Keynesian economic policies. Right? And Maddock, predicted in the 60s, in fact, as far back as the 50s, based on Marxist. Basically what Maddock did was try to extend the basic Marxian theory of the falling rate of profit and crises to an analysis of the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of Keynesian policies to solve the problem of crises in capitalist economies. Right? He concluded and predicted that Keynesian policies would not be able to solve the crisis tendencies in capitalist economies, and sooner or later the post-war prosperity would end, right? And there would be more crises, ongoing crises. And I think this is a tremendous scientific achievement that Maddock, on the basis of Marxist theory, was able to foresee and predict the crises that capitalism is now going through on the basis of Marxist theory 50 years ago. And almost alone, including among radical economists and even Marxian economists. Moran and Sweezy about this time were publishing Monopoly Capital that argued that monopolies could overcome the tendency, the rate of profit to fall, and therefore could stabilize capitalism along with Keynesian type policies. And I think Maddock was like the greatest Marxist economist of the 20th century, in my view, and has not received the attention he deserves. And one reason why he hasn't is that Maddock was not a professor. He was not an academic. He was actually an industrial worker, one of the rare worker-intellectuals in the Marxian tradition. It was our great fortune that Maddock agreed to meet on a regular basis with our capital study group. So he became kind of our tutor for a year. This was a tremendous opportunity, and I think really gave me and us a very deep and sound understanding of Marxist theory. One of the points that Maddock emphasized that has stayed with me and plays an important role in this book as well is that the distinction in Marxist theory between the production of surplus value and the distribution of surplus value. That Marxist theory, especially in Volume 1, is primarily a macro economic theory, and the main question addressed is the determination of the total surplus value produced in the economy as a whole. It's a macro theory. It's often interpreted, volume 1, as a micro theory, as if it's about individual prices. But that was not Marx's concern. Marx was primarily with explaining profit, surplus value in the economy as a whole, and of course concluded that the total surplus value is determined by the total surplus labor of workers in the economy as a whole. And then volume 3 is about the distribution of surplus value, the division of the total surplus value into industrial profit, commercial profit, interest, and rent. So these are the individual parts, or what Marx called the particular forms of surplus value. And this analysis of the distribution of surplus value in volume 3 presupposed, right, took as given the total amount of surplus value that is divided up in these individual parts. The total amount is presupposed as already determined in the prior volumes 1 and 2. So there's a kind of clear logical sequence, right, from the macro, the determination of the total surplus value, to the microeconomic question of the division of the total surplus value into individual parts. And so Maddock argued against Sweezy that monopolies do not overcome the falling rate of profit because what monopolies do is affect the distribution of surplus value. A greater share goes to monopoly industries, but that means that there is less surplus value left over for competitive industries. But this does not change the total amount of surplus value because that depends on surplus labor. And that's generally not affected by monopolies in industries. So this was one of the main lessons that I learned from Maddock in this kind of informal study group, informal learning situation outside the university, basically motivated by political activity and the increasing conviction that capitalism was the problem, right? And Marxist theory made sense of that to me. Made sense of the world. That a profit is produced by surplus labor, and that then explains pretty much everything that goes on in capitalist economies. Then in 1974, the University of Massachusetts started a new radical economics PhD program, which you may have heard of. Marcelo has his PhD from UMass, but this was just started in the mid-'70s, and I was living in Massachusetts and heard about this, and I decided, well, I'll give that a try. I wasn't sure where exactly that would lead, and I was thinking more about maybe I would become an economist for unions. But in any case, I entered the UMass graduate program in the kind of first class of the new radical economics PhD program. And that was also in many ways a very exciting program because almost all of the other PhD students were there for the same reason that I was, having grown out of political interest and political activities. And we were able to get a PhD in economics with those kind of radical interests. I wrote my PhD dissertation on empirical estimates of the rate of surplus value in the U.S. economy in the post-war period up through the mid-70s. And taking into account Marx's distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor, right? So, you know, as some of you may have some idea, doing empirical work within the framework of Marxian economics, using the official government national income accounts, is often a very challenging and difficult process, because the official data is constructed in order to conform to the categories of mainstream economics, especially Keynesian macroeconomics, and not the concepts and the variables of Marxian theory. So there's a lot of work to be done to modify the official estimates to conform more rigorously to Marxist concepts. And, you know, UMass, we call it University UMass, was one of the few places in the country where one could write a PhD dissertation of that nature in Marxian economics and estimates of the rate of surplus value. One kind of difficult part of my dissertation was in many respects a critique of the profit squeeze theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that. You know, that in the late 60s and early 70s, unemployment was low, and so that enabled workers to get faster wage increases, and that squeezed or reduced profits, right? But I argued that that theory ignored Marx's distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor, right? And if you make that distinction, then it turns out that most of the decline in the rate of profit was due to a rise in unproductive labor and not to a reduction in the rate of surplus value. But the difficult part was my dissertation advisor, right, was Jim Crotty, who himself was a major proponent, advocate of the profit squeeze theory. So that's not something I would recommend to fight with your dissertation advice. Although Crotty was actually is a great man and a great human being, and he was tough on me, but he also allowed me to have my own ideas. That was a kind of a problem for me in general in graduate school, because when I entered graduate school I was 28. I had studied Marx quite a bit, and I think had quite a sound understanding. But I was also still young and naive that I thought, well, professors, they would know a whole lot more than me, and I could learn from them and develop further. It turned out that many of the radical economists were not that knowledgeable about Marx, and so I had a lot of disagreements. Let's just put it that way. And not all professors were as kind of decent as Crotty. And sometimes professors don't like it when students have their own ideas. And I insisted. And so, there were, in fact, I was telling Marcelo last night that the only class in graduate school that I did not get an A in was Marxian economics. Because I had a different interpretation than the professor, and the professor marked me down as a result. So I'm sure that doesn't happen here, but it does, and you have to I'm sure you've kind of recognized, but stick to your own ideas. And I think in the long run you'll make a better contribution. I think, but also figure out a way to get a PhD, so you can have some employment. Then for the next decade or so, I got a series of temporary jobs, one-year jobs, and then finally got a more permanent job in a small college up in the state of Maine, way up in the northeast, next to Canada. I don't the U.S. educational system has really kind of, many tiers, but 3 different types of colleges, right? One is the big research universities, right? The UMass and Harvard and Princeton and University of Wisconsin and Michigan, all the big research universities is at the top, right? Then there's another category in the middle called liberal arts colleges. I don't know if you're familiar. It's kind of uniquely U.S., I think. They're small colleges, often 2,000 students, 2,000 to 3,000 students, and with small classes, right? I mean, there would be 20 or 30 students in a class. In the university, there would be 200 or 300, right? If not more, right? So originally, these liberal arts colleges were for the elite, right? Because they're expensive, right? To have that low a student to teacher ratio is expensive, but it's also a better education. You have more interaction with the professors and more personal attention. But over in the 60s, the liberal arts colleges were transformed to some extent and opened up and became more diverse, and more financial aid was granted to lower income students and lower income families. So by the time I started teaching in the 80s, a lot of that transformation had already occurred. It's still somewhat elite, and it's certainly still much more expensive, but the financial aid kind of levels the playing field somewhat. But it turns out that these liberal arts colleges are the perfect place for Marxist economists. First of all, the big universities won't hire us, right? They're the gatekeepers, they're the guards of the profession, right? And so no Marxists can enter. But the liberal arts, their stated purpose, the liberal arts colleges, were to teach critical thinking and to study the great thinkers of Western civilization. I mean, that's the way, very broad, critical education. And so, I would, in job interviews, I would make the argument, well, surely Marx qualifies, right, as one of the great thinkers, right? And, and he does, obviously, and, and that's where most UMass graduates got our jobs, right, in the liberal arts colleges. The liberal arts colleges are kind of concentrated in the Northeast, and so that geographically that was convenient also. So I was teaching in a small college in Maine. Unfortunately, my wife was teaching in a small college in Massachusetts. So we had a commuter marriage for a decade or so. But what I worked on then in my research was to convert my dissertation into a book, as so many other people do, but I had to expand it beyond the rate of surplus value to the other key variables in Marxian theory, and ultimately, of course, the rate of profit and the composition of capital, and the relative proportions of productive and unproductive labor. Right? So then the book of those empirical estimates. So the first decade and a half of my career was really spent on these empirical issues. And so my book was published in '91, entitled "The Falling Rate of Profit in the Post-War U.S. Economy." Right? And so I'd be happy to talk about these empirical issues and the kind of challenges and difficulties if there's interest later. But then I became more and more interested in more abstract theory. And in particular in the transformation problem. This century-long criticism of Marxist theory, the kind of single, I think, most important logical criticism of Marxist theory, and the main reason that mainstream economists and others have used to reject Marxist theory. There is a logical contradiction between Marxist theory of surplus value in Volume 1 and the tendency toward equal rates of profit in Volume 3. Right? That the labor theory of value and surplus value seems to suggest that industries with unequal industries that have more labor proportionally should have a higher rate of profit. Seems to be a straightforward logical deduction, right? And so that's the criticism, that the labor theory of value cannot explain and is contradicted by the tendency toward equal rates of profit across industries with unequal ratios of capital to labor. And so I got more and more interested and just decided I wanted to tackle, and study in depth this most important criticism of Marxist theory. So that's what I spent pretty much the next 20 years working on, with various other side projects as well. And my intuition at the beginning was that the logical criticism, based originally on Borkowitz and his critique and correction of Marxist theory in the early 20th century, that was based on a misunderstanding of Marx's logic, right? The logical structure of capital, and particularly not understanding this key feature that I learned from Maddock of the prior determination of the total surplus value, and then the subsequent theory of the distribution of surplus value. So, but I realized this was a somewhat philosophical issue. The logical structure of Marxist theory, which I had no training in. I had limited understanding of, just an intuition, and because of my study with Maddock especially. One of the things I did in order to kind of work on this problem was I formed a little research group that came to be known as the International Symposium on Marxian Theory. I don't know if it is ISMT, International Symposium on Marxian Theory. And the way that happened is the following. I told you I was teaching in Maine, my wife in Massachusetts. Finally, I managed to get a job at her institution, at her college. So we could get together, but it just so happened that the salaries at her institution were lower than at my institution, right? In part because Maine is way up in the woods, and they have to pay a premium in order to attract. And whereas my wife's is in the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts, which is a very desirable place to be, and so the salaries are lower. So, you know, when I was negotiating with the dean, he said, well, your salary will fit in about here in the economics department, which was about a 10% wage cut. But he knew that he had me, that I would not refuse the salary. But so I asked him, well, you know, would you please just give me a one-time grant? You know, just $4,000 or $5,000. I mean, not that much to do for my own research, right? And I kind of had an idea at the time that I wanted to form this research group, but I wasn't sure exactly how to do it or even what the subject was completely, right? But after a couple of years, I finally clarified that you know, I wanted to work on this question of Marx's logic, the logical structure of capital, and for that I needed not only economists but also philosophers, right? And so I tried to identify the half dozen other Marxist economists and philosophers who had written on this and who I thought I could learn from, right? And maybe we could work together. And so I invited 7 other people to come for a week at my college for an intensive week of study and discussion. And it turned out, you know, and I knew 2 of the 7. The other 5 I did not know. I had read their stuff, right? And I wrote them and said, you know, I read this or that. You know, I'm trying to do this. Can you join us? And I used the few $1,000s to pay their airfare. You know, then I had no money left for food, so I ended up pretty much cooking for them myself in my house and actually that turned out to be an advantage because it kind of made us friends a little bit. You know, we were dining together, and when you're eating at home, you know, wine is a whole lot cheaper, and so we could enjoy ourselves as well. And the format of this is part of why I'm telling you this. This I would highly recommend if you ever get a chance to do this. Is a small, what we call working group, right? There were 8 of us, right? We met for a week, right? And so there would be 2 sessions a day, right? And 1 paper per session, right? So it's not like your regular academic conference, which is oftentimes just a kind of superficial show, right? Where you have 20 minutes to present a paper, and then they go on to somebody else, and then you're off to another session, right? It's 1 session a day. 2 sessions a day, 1 paper per session, and the other critical factor, papers had to be distributed in advance a month early. Okay, so everybody comes to the conference having read the papers, right? And you know, increasingly often with written comments that they had sent to the authors, right? And so, you know, the session did not start then with a half-hour presentation, but instead started with comments from the other participants, and then there would be, you know, a 3-hour discussion. And then we would go have lunch and come back and do another paper in the afternoon. And so I highly recommend this format if you ever have a chance to do that. You know, it doesn't have to be 8, but, you know, a small number of dedicated scholars, and plenty of time for discussion, and papers distributed in advance, with the requirement that they came ready to discuss. Right? And I mean, I only had $4,000, so that was it. And I wasn't really thinking about anything beyond that year, right? But the group itself decided, this is great. This has been such a productive experience. Let's do it again, right? And so, I actually got a little more money from my college, but mainly, academics can usually get money from their own college to travel to conferences. And so everybody said, we'll do what we can. And so we decided to meet the next year. And then we decided to meet the next year. And we actually ended up meeting for 20 years. Finally, some of us retired and could no longer get travel money, and we'd sort of pretty much, we were saying the same things over and over again, and so it had kind of, I hate to use the term diminishing returns, but it was kind of less productive after a certain point. But this was one of the things I think I'm most proud of in my career, and most happy and most enthusiastic about this idea of a small working conference. We had published. We can go online, and it doesn't have a great website, but at least you can see a little bit about we ended up publishing 9 books out of the 20 years. 9 conference volumes. There's one volume on Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3 of Capital. There's one of the latest ones was Marxist Theory of Money. Marxist theory for the 21st century, in modern money. Marx and Hegel was one of the last ones. So if you're interested in these kind of logical, methodological issues, I hope you would find something of interest. And then finally, I guess chronologically here, moving on up to recent years, I finished my book. Right? And this was just published last year. It's now also out in a paperback. And I would obviously, if you're interested, be eager to talk some more about my book in discussion. Let me just say a couple of points to perhaps pique your interest. I argue, I call it a macro-monetary interpretation of Marxist theory, Marxist logic. And I've already talked about the macro aspect, right? That Volume 1 is primarily a macro theory of the total surplus value, which is then presupposed in the subsequent theory of the distribution of surplus value in Volume 3. But the other important aspect, which I came to appreciate more over time, is that Marxist theory is primarily a monetary theory. Volume 1 especially is often interpreted as being only about labor time quantities, right? And you only get them prices and money and prices in Volume 3, with prices of production and profit, right? But I argue that's a misinterpretation of Volume 1, right? That Volume 1 is essentially a monetary theory. Money is derived in Chapter 1. If you're familiar, Section 3 of Chapter 1. Right? Marx derives money as a necessary feature in capitalism, as the necessary form of appearance of the labor value of commodities. Right? So from then on, right? I mean, chapter 2, chapter 3 is the functions of money. Chapter 4, right? Part 2 is the transformation of money into capital, right? With the general formula for capital. And then, and the general formula is MC, in English, right? MC, M prime, right? What is it in port? Day, M, day prime. And where the M prime is M plus delta M, right? The increment, right? That is the most important characteristic of capitalist economies, right? Money becoming more money. Right? And I think that is the main phenomenon that Volume 1 is intended to explain. Right? How does this happen? Right? Marx says on a number of occasions, before production, we had a capital of 500 pounds. Right? After production, we have a capital of 600 pounds. Right? The original 500 plus an increment of 100. How does that happen? Right? And it happens because of surplus labor. This is eventually Marx's answer. But the point is that the theory is not just about surplus labor. It's how surplus labor determines the monetary quantity, the all-important delta N, right? So this I think is also crucial for an understanding of Marxist theory, and of course the full version of the circuit of money capital includes production, right? So it's MC ... P, right? For production, ... C prime, M prime, right? M plus delta M, right? And so this, I argue, this circuit of money capital is the basic logical framework of Marxist theory, right? This is the main phenomenon that he's trying to explain, and this is the structure that he is using to explain that. Right? A given amount of money purchases inputs, right? Those inputs are employed in production, right? Production results with the commodity output, right? Which is then sold for more money, right? And so this is the structure. This is the three phases of the circuit of money capital. And what I argue is that logical structure, the circuit of money capital, NC, ... suggests that the starting point of Marxist theory is the initial N at the beginning of the circuit of money capital. Right? That's the starting point, and that is what is taken as given in order to explain the M prime at the end of the circuit. Right? The initial M is presupposed, is taken as given in order to explain, along with the labor in production, right? To explain the delta M at the end of the circuit. Right? And I argue that same logical structure, the circuit of money capital, also applies to Marxist theory of prices of production in Volume 3. Right? Except now, the MC, etc., refer not to the total economy, right, but to individual industries. Right? So I symbolize it as M sub I, right, with a subscript I, dash C sub I. So you can kind of disaggregate the total circuit of money capital into individual industries, right? And the question that Marx's theory of prices of production is trying to answer is, how is that initial M sub I, that initial money capital advance, how is that recovered, right? Together with the average profit, based on the money capital advance in each industry at the beginning, at establishing. Right? So I argue the circuit of money capital is the framework both for the macro theory of the total surplus value in volume 1 and for the micro theory of the distribution of surplus value and prices of production in volume 3. And the crucial point is the same quantities of money capital are taken as given at both levels of abstraction, both in volume 1 and in volume 3. Right? And the same quantities that are taken as given are the actual quantities of money capital advanced. Right? And these actual quantities cannot be explained in volume 1, but they are finally explained in volume 3 as equal to the prices of production. Right? And so for this reason, there is no transformation problem. Right? Because the transformation problem is Marx forgot to transform the inputs. Right? I mean, that's the Borkowitz critique. That Marx forgot to transform the inputs of constant capital and variable capital from values to prices of production. Right? I argue that that's wrong. That Marx did not fail to transform the inputs because the inputs do not have to be transformed. Right? The inputs are already equal to prices of production in volume 1. We just don't know that yet. That can't be explained yet because first you have to explain prices of production before the prices of those inputs can be explained. Right? So the transformation of the inputs from values to price of production is not necessary, it's not appropriate for Marxist theory. The same quantities are taken as given, and so it follows, easily, straightforwardly from this interpretation that there's no transformation problem. Marx's theory of prices of production is logically consistent and complete. And the two aggregate equalities, total price is equal to total value, total profit is equal to total surplus value. There's only one rate of profit, etc. Okay, so I know that's a lot to sit and listen to in 5 minutes, but I would be happy to come back. I just wanted to give you a flavor for what my argument is, right? So I think, and what it really is a reinterpretation of volume 1. Right? And volume 1 is not about a hypothetical economy. This is usually the interpretation, a hypothetical economy in which commodities exchange at their values. Right? I argue that's not true. Volume 1 is primarily a macro theory, is not about individual commodities prices at all. Right? And volume 1 is about the actual quantities of money capital advanced and recovered, right? Which is first explained at the macro level and then at the micro level. So I'll move on for now, and thanks for your patience. And I hope maybe we can come back to this. One of the other features of my book, let me give you, here's the table of contents. Is 2 parts, right? Part 1 is a presentation of my interpretation. A general introduction, and then an algebraic summary that I hope clarifies the logic as algebra can do sometimes. Then chapters 3 and 4 are then a very extensive review of the textual evidence to support this interpretation. And the textual evidence from all the drafts of capital, starting with the Grundrisse, right, and then the manuscript of 61-63, and then the manuscript of 64-65, the volume 3 manuscript, and then the final versions of capital. Chapter 3 is about the textual evidence to support the macro aspect, the production and distribution of surplus value, and then Chapter 4 is about the monetary aspect and the circuit of money capital. That the M at the beginning of the circuit is a presupposition for the theory of delta M at the end of the circuit. As I say, this is an extensive review of the textual evidence in all the drafts of capital, a lot of which is not well known, I think, and some of which has been published for the first time only in recent decades. So part of what I'm arguing is it's worth taking another look at this issue now that we have some new volumes published, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a minute, where there is substantial new textual evidence. Chapter 3 is 80 pages, chapter 4 is 100 pages. Right? So it's an extensive review, and I think it provides substantial support for this interpretation. Then part 2, I hope will be of use not only to advanced scholars but also to young scholars, maybe just getting interested in this and would like to study deeper. It's basically a review of a half dozen of other interpretations and reinterpretations of Marxist theory over the last 2 or 3 decades. It starts with the standard interpretation, the Bortkiewicz, Sweezy, Steedman interpretation, then the new interpretation, especially Foley's version. That's actually Foley. Duncan Foley was one of the reasons, and his new interpretation of the transformation problem was one of the reasons I got interested in this. He published his paper in 1982, right? Just as I was getting my PhD, and so in the next decade I became more and more interested in. And basically, I consider my interpretation a kind of logical extension of the new interpretation. I don't know if you're familiar. The new interpretation argues that, similar to mine, that that variable capital, right, the part of the initial M that purchases labor power, right, that is taken as given as the actual money wage, right, instead of the real wage, as in the Bortkiewicz interpretation, right, and that money wage is taken as given, and the same money wage is taken as given both in the theory of surplus value and in the theory of prices of production, right? But the new interpretation, it determines constant capital, right, the other part of the initial M, in the standard way, right, as being derived from the quantity of means of production. First is values, and then is prices of production. So the new interpretation ends up with a transformation problem, right? And it ends up, I think, with a logical inconsistency between the determination of variable capital and constant capital. Right? Variable capital and constant capital are the two components of the initial M. Right? M is equal to C plus B. Right? So that suggests that both C and V should be determined in the same way, right? And not in two different ways. And that's basically what I do. I extend the new interpretation to take as given not only the variable capital, right, but also the constant capital. Right? And so that removes this inconsistency in the new interpretation and eliminates the transformation problem. I considered originally calling my interpretation the new interpretation. But I think macro monetary is more descriptive. So that's just trying to say how important that was for the development of my own theory. And then the TSSI, temporal single system interpretation, you've probably heard of, the rethinking Marxism, the Ben Fine and Saad Philo, who emphasizes the organic composition of capital. So, as I say, this is a pretty extensive review of the literature on this important question over the last couple of decades, which I hope will be useful for scholars in the future that are interested in working on this subject. Okay, so the textual evidence I want to say a little bit more about as a general phenomenon, not just my research, but is the publication of the new German Marx Engels collected works. I don't know if you've run across this yet. It's abbreviated as the MEGA, M-E-G-A, the MEGA, right? Stands for Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, German for collected works, right? And this was started in the 1970s, primarily in Moscow, primarily in the Soviet Union, also East Berlin, and this was going to be like 120 volumes, right? It would consist of 4 sections. Section 2 is the main section, for me anyway. This is all the drafts of capital, right? And I'll say more about that in a minute. Section 1 is minor works, like the economic manuscripts of 1844, 45, Poverty of Philosophy, Critique of the Gotha Program, etc. Those kind of minor publications is 1. The drafts of volume of Capital is part 2. Part 3 are letters, and part 4 is publication of all of Marx's and Engels' research notebooks. Right? Just notes that they were taking. So some of this will obviously be of more interest than others, and it's mostly all in German so far, so that limits its accessibility. But you know, and a lot of it is just excerpts. You know, just Marx writing down what he's reading for further use. You know? I mean, this was before photocopies, right? So if you wanna be able to use something later, you had to write it down, right? And so a lot of these notebooks. So, you know, I'm sure there's some nuggets there, some valuable stuff. But for me, the main section is section 2, and section 2 has now been published in German completely. There's like 25 different volumes. There weren't 25 drafts, but there are 4 or 5 volumes for a couple of the drafts. Right? And the last volume was published in 2012. Right? And so let me say a little bit more. I hope you'll be interested in the manuscript of 61-63 and the manuscript of 64. This is 18, of course, 1864-65. The way I first, you know, I'm just, you know, a hopelessly narrow Anglophile. I speak a little Spanish, but and a tiny little bit of German. But so I wasn't, you know, in 1990, you know, I was, you know, in my mid-30s by this time. I didn't know anything about the Mega. I just had not come across the Mega yet. And the first time I heard about the Mega was an article in Capital in Class by Michael Heinrich. You've run across that name. He's you know, leading German Marxist editor of the Poplar journal, and he wrote a paper about the manuscript of 61-63. It turns out this is very interesting. Right? The manuscript, about 2/3 of that manuscript is the theories of surplus value. Right? So that's nothing new. Right? Although the theories of surplus value was rearranged in some cases in ways that are misleading and confusing. But basically the content of the theories of surplus value, has been published in England, in English a long time ago. Actually, not that long ago. The theories of surplus value was first, the English translation was published in the 1960s. Right, so just about the time my generation was coming up, and a significant number of Marxist economists in the United States for the very first time. Right, I mean, my generation is really the first to have Marx scholars of any numbers, I didn't realize this at the time, but the theories of surplus value had just been published. In English a few years before. But what I want to emphasize now is that there is another third of this manuscript, 6163, which was published for the first time in German in the 70s, and a full English translation of the whole thing was published in a series of 5 volumes in the 1980s. Okay? And this is very interesting. The previously unpublished material is very interesting. The manuscript starts out with a second draft of volume 1. Right? The first draft is a Grundrisse. Right? And so this manuscript 6163 starts out with, actually it starts with part 2 of volume 1, the transformation of money into capital. Right? I mean, part 1 he had already kind of rewritten in the contribution to a critique of political economy. So he starts this manuscript 6163 with part 2, transformation, and it's really interesting. Right? If you're interested in these kind of subjects, I highly recommend. It's like a transition draft between the Grundrisse and the final versions of volume 1. It's more kind of much better organized than the Grundrisse. The Grundrisse is kind of rambling and disorganized, right? It's the first draft, right? So the second draft in the 6163 is, in terms of organization and logical order, is almost in the final form, right? But its advantage over the final versions is it still has more kind of methodological comments about Marx's logic and what he's doing, right? And how he's structuring the book and the kind of methodological grounding for the logical structure. The Grundrisse has a lot of that, right? And the manuscript 6163 continues to have not as much as the Grundrisse, but a fair amount of very interesting and illuminating. But unfortunately, in the final published versions of Volume 1, most of those methodological comments were deleted, right? As Marx tried to simplify and popularize for a wider audience, which, there's good reason for that, but from a scholarly point of view, it's unfortunate. And I think it's kind of left a legacy of ambiguity and controversy and misunderstanding, right? So I think this second draft of Volume 1 really helps to clarify Marx's logic in the final versions of Volume 1, which is not as transparent, which is not as clear and obvious. So then after going through part 4, right, the relative surplus value, a draft of part 4, Marx breaks off in this manuscript and starts the theories of surplus value, right, that we're familiar with. And this was kind of Marx's normal procedure of first presenting his own theory, right, and then kind of reviewing the classical theories, in the contribution to a critique. The chapter 1 is on commodities and the theory of value, and then the last section of that chapter 1 of the contribution is the classical theories of value, right? And then chapter 2 of the contribution is his theory of money, right? And then he has a final section that reviews the classical, from a critical point of view, the classical theories of money. So I think Marx is doing similar procedure in this manuscript 61, 63. He first presented his own theory of surplus value, and then he reviews the classical theories of surplus value. It's just that this took much, much longer than the earlier versions of value and money, and in ways that Marx did not anticipate. One of the really interesting things that I discovered in this research is, here's a surplus value, most of you are familiar with. Volume 1 of Theories of Surplus Value is mostly Adam Smith. Right? Then Volume 2, does anybody remember what Volume 2 starts with? The chapter? It's on Rodbertus. Karl Rodbertus. I don't know about you, but I wondered for a long time, who the hell is Rodbertus? And what's he doing here? Right? It turns out, it is clear that this book was written in the 1850s, right, by a minor German economist, and it's about Ricardo's theory of rent, right? This chapter is out of place, both chronologically, right, because after Adam Smith comes Ricardo, right? Or maybe Malthus or Say, or the early 20th century, not jumping to 1850, right? And it also is about rent, right? Which has to do with the distribution of surplus value rather than the production of surplus value. So this is out of place both chronologically and logically, right? Turns out if you read the footnotes, the endnotes in the Mega, the way that happened was Marx had a copy of Rodbertus's book that had been loaned to him by LaSalle. Right? So he had a borrowed copy, and then LaSalle wrote Marx saying he wanted his book back. Right? Please send me the copy of Rodbertus. I want it now. I want it. So Marx realized that he needed to read it, before he sent the book back. Right? So this is completely just kind of fortuitous. Right? It was not planned. He was just responding to a request to please send my book back. Right? So he reads the book. Right? And it turns out to be more interesting than he thought, I think. And it starts Marx on a very creative exploratory period about the distribution of surplus value. Right? The Grundrisse is entirely about the production of surplus value. Right? There's nothing about prices of production, interest, rent, none of that. Right? Maybe a few asides, right? But no real discussion. Right? So he reads Rodbertus. He realizes in order to explain rent, I first got to explain prices of production, right? Especially in order to explain absolute rent, which is what the issue was. I've got to explain. So in that first chapter of Volume 2 of Theories of Surplus Value, Marx sketches out for the first time his theory of prices of production. Right? If you look at about 60 pages into that chapter, is a first draft, very first time, right, where he has just 3 industries, I think, A, B, and C, and then how prices of production are determined by an equalization of the profit rate across industries, right? So this kind of forced Marx, or allowed Marx, or stimulated Marx to begin to think more about the distribution of surplus value. And if you look at the rest of Theories of Surplus Value, he also begins to talk about interest. Right? There's a long section on interest. There is a long chapter on rent. Right? So it really helps you to see theories of surplus value in a new light. Right? That what Marx is doing here is exploring, developing for the first time his theory of the distribution of surplus value. Right? And then after the theories of surplus value, there's another 200 pages, right? Previously unpublished. That's very interesting. Part of it is a draft of the beginning of volume 3, right? I think that's the main thing. So anyway, I think this manuscript 6163 is my favorite manuscript. Because I think it shows Marx at his creative best. And helps you see how he is developing his theory of the distribution of surplus value. Okay, so then the manuscript of 6465. That is Marx's original volume 3 manuscript. I'll get back to this in a minute. That was never published even in German. Right? Marx's manuscript that he wrote in 64-65, that's what Engels used, right, to edit and publish the volume 3 that we know. Right? But it's a very kind of rough and uneven manuscript, Marx's original manuscript. Some of the parts are almost in final form, but some are really rough. And so Engels had a lot of work to do to make them in published form, right? But Marx's original manuscript had never been published even in German. Kind of curious why that happened. I think part of it was, Kautsky and the rest were trying to equate Marx and Engels, right? And there's no difference between them. We have Engels' volume, so we don't need Marx's manuscript. I don't know. But for whatever reason, it was published for the first time in 1992 in German, right? And there was no English translation. Right? I should say, I told you the Mega was originally supposed to be 120 volumes, but there was a major catastrophe and a major crisis in the Mega in that the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And the Soviet Union was the money, right? They were providing not only the money for the Mega, the German Mega, but also for the English translations. The English publishers in the U.S. is International Publishers. Maybe in England it's Lawrence Wisser. They had a contract and agreed to translate into English 50 of the 120 Mega volumes, right? And originally, Marx's manuscript, 64-65, was supposed to be translated as part of that 50-volume Marx Engels collected works. But by the time the German volume was published in 1992, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the money was gone, and so what International Publishers did was just republish Engels Volume 3 in the slot where that translation was supposed to go, and so nothing new, right? No new scholarly value there to Engels Volume, which we all know. So when I discovered this, in the mid-90s, from Heinrich, I started trying to raise the money for an English translation. I first went to International Publishers, and they barely were breathing. And they had no money for this. But there's almost no money for Marx scholarship in the United States. Just, is just a fact of life. Not only is international publishers and related publishers barely existing, but foundations and research institutes. I made many proposals and always got it. Finally, about 5 or 6 years ago, 10 years later, I managed to scrape together 3 grants from 3 small foundations, which was just barely enough for the translation, right? So now I am very happy to say that it's been published. An English translation of Marx's original manuscript, manuscript 6465, and here is, whoops, how am I going to get this? Is it open already or not? Oh, wait a minute. This is it. Yeah, you're right. There it is. Translated by Ben Folks, one of the top English translators. Marx's only full draft, volume 3. We know edited, heavily edited. It's been a long-standing question whether or not there are significant differences between Marx's original and Engels' edited version. Published for the first time in German in '92, and now published for the first time. So I write a long introduction where I try to highlight and identify the main changes that Engels made to Marx's manuscript. And most of them are not that significant. I mean, I think the bottom line is Engels did not change the meaning of volume 3 in any significant way, except for one thing. Engels changed the title. That surprised and disappointed me. Marx's title in English is The Forms of the Process as a Whole. Right? Engels dropped the word forms, which is the main word. I mean, the book is about the forms of appearance of surplus value in capital, right? He deleted the key word. And his title is The Capitalist Process as a Whole. Right? So that's a misleading change. I mean, I think part of the problem was Engels didn't really fully understand Marxist theory. And especially as incredible and disingenuous as that might sound, I'm convinced is true. And especially volume 3. Right? I mean, I think he understood very well volume 1 and the production of surplus value, but how volume 3 fit within volume 1, Engels, I think, had very limited understanding of, as incredible as it might seem, but as is evidenced by this striking the key word forms from his title. Another kind of evidence of Engels' limited understanding was Engels wrote a letter to Marx in 1868. So this is after volume 1, the first edition, right, just after. And Engels says, how do you explain commercial profit? Right? So that's a good question. Right? I mean, commercial capital is only engaged in circulation, right? Circulation, no additional value and surplus value. So where do merchants get their profit? Right? I think somebody else had asked Engels that question, and Engels didn't know the answer, right? And so Engels asked Marx. And so there's a series of letters back and forth. And then there's a final letter. If you're interested in this, write this down. April 30th, 1868. A really excellent, Marx eventually writes a long letter, it's about 6 printed pages, of a summary of Volume 3, part by part. Especially through Part 4, which is, of course, commercial profit, right? So he goes through Part 1, Part 2, prices of production, Part 3, the falling rate of profit, Part 4, commercial profit, explaining in detail Marx's logic, right? And so, but Engels' question and Marx's long, detailed answer indicates Engels was asking this question for the first time, right? And didn't really have a complete understanding, right? And the other thing that I discovered that's kind of disappointing is there doesn't seem to have been any other instructions by Marx to Engels about how to deal with Volume 3. Volume 2 or 3. First of all, there are no letters, right? We know that. I mean, part of the reason why there are no letters is Engels moved from Manchester to London in 1870, right? So all the letters are before, now there's no longer need for letters, right? They see each other, all the time, right? So, but there's also, nobody knows of any other discussions between Marx and Engels about how to organize volumes 2 and 3, right? In fact, one of the other, detailed footnotes indicates that Marx did not even tell Engels directly and in person, please do something with the manuscripts. Right? It's up to you, Fred. And maybe even, one would hope some instructions about how to do it, or what to look for, or what's the main organization principles, the main logic. Instead, Marx told his daughter, Eleanor, to tell Fred to please do something with the manuscripts. So it's like, it was the elephant. Engels' own explanation for this is Marx never brought it up to me because he knew if he did, I would beat him over the head and tell him to publish the damn thing. Right? Get it done, finish. Right? And so Marx avoided the subject. And so it's Engels, out of respect or whatever, avoided the subject. So it's like the elephant in the room, for 15 years. But it's hard to imagine, really, not more discussion or communication about that. So my introduction, by the way, I'd be happy to send an e-copy of either one of these books to anybody who's interested. Just don't tell Brill where you got them, but or at least my introduction you might be interested in to kind of see what the main differences, the main changes Engels made. The main changes were to Part 5, right, which there's a lot of interest in these days. Interest and interest-bearing capital, right, and financial capital, right? This is a hot topic today, and so people are rereading Part 5. Unfortunately, Part 5, even in Engels' polished version, is still a mess. There's still a lot of it is just research notes. He's taken notes on parliamentary reports on the crisis of 1847 in 1857. You know, that he had experienced himself, and they had parliamentary hearings on the causes. And so, I mean, I think most of Part 5 doesn't belong in the book. You know, I mean, it's relevant, but it's too concrete. Right? What belongs in the book are the first 4 chapters of Part 5 on interest and interest-bearing capital, and those, you know, those are the theoretical chapters that fit in with the forms of surplus value in the book as a whole. But the rest of Part 5 is just too concrete, and I think Marx was interested in crises, obviously, and he just got carried away, I think, in terms of this more concrete study. It doesn't really fit in the more abstract volume 3 as a whole. Marx said in a letter to Engels that he was just having fun. He said, nothing is more amusing than to hear these bankers and economists sound off and they have no clue what they're talking about, right? So I think this is part of what Marx was doing in Part 5, was just amusing himself. Because, you know, Marx loved to do that, right? To kind of take apart satirically the classical economists. So, unfortunately, Part 5, you know, it took Engels 11 years to edit his volume 3. And most of that time was spent on Part 5. You know, he just kept trying to whip it into shape. You know, kept trying to make it presentable and look finished. And he said he tried 3 times to rewrite the whole thing, and then he gave up. Right? So it's really too bad. I mean, he should have just, but he was just trying to follow what, you know, without really understanding, just include what Marx included. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, the 11 years, it cost him his health, and even one could say his life. Engels died a year in 1895, right, 1 year after his volume 3 was published, of throat cancer. So, I mean, it wasn't really because of the manuscripts. But the last decade of his life was devoted to this difficult task of trying to get this volume in publishable shape, unfortunately most of which from the Part 5, which really didn't belong. It would have been a lot easier if he would have recognized that, published a shorter version and held the other out maybe for a later volume. Let me just give you one more example of a change, a fairly significant change Engels made in Part 3, the falling rate of profit, right? The all-important falling rate of profit. There's one long paragraph where Marx is talking about the tendencies and the counter tendencies of the falling rate of profit. And there's one sentence in Engels Volume 3 that says, in the long run, the rate of profit will definitely fall. Right? So a very strong conclusion. You may have noticed that, and there's been some discussion of that one sentence. Right? The sentence actually doesn't make sense in the whole paragraph, because the whole paragraph is really much more uncertain, right? And tendencies and counter tendencies, right? It turns out Engels wrote the sentence, right? It's not Marx's sentence. So that has given rise to a long controversy about Marx's conclusions that unfortunately we didn't know that that was not Marx's sentence. There's one other change. A few pages later, Marx says something like, if it weren't for these counter tendencies, or the centralization, concentration and centralization of capital, he says something like capital goes through various tremors. It's a kind of weak word in German, Klappen. It means kind of shakes or tremors, like an earthquake, kind of the earth shaking. Engels changed the word Klappen to the German word Zusammenbruch, right, which means breakdown, right, collapse. So the mega editors argue that this one word kind of gave rise to Kautsky and the breakdown, Grossman, the breakdown theorist of the Second International. The mega editors conclude here that there's so many changes that Engels Volume 3 really should not be considered Marx's book. It should be considered Engels' book. I think that's way too extreme. I think, as long as we understand what the changes are. I mean, I think, the two main parts are Part 2 on the prices of production and Part 3 on the falling rate of profit. Part 2 is very little changes, and Part 3 only has these changes that I've already mentioned. So I think the mega editors are too extreme in their conclusions, but they say, I agree with them in that further research on Volume 3, right, really should be in terms of Marx's original manuscript. It's not that much different, but to the extent that it might be different here and there, this is really what the scholarly work should be based on from now on. I understand, by the way, that in terms of Portuguese, there's not yet a Portuguese translation of 64, 65. I would recommend that should be a high priority for Marxian scholarship. And in terms of the manuscript 61, 63, correct me if I'm wrong, what I understand is that part of the previously unpublished parts of that, beyond theories of surplus value has been translated into Portuguese. I think maybe the beginning part, the second draft of Volume 1. But there's still parts of that manuscript not yet translated into Portuguese. So at least the English is available, but it would obviously be better to have the Portuguese too. Okay, well, I've got some other minor research projects I was going to mention, but maybe I'll stop there. And how we do it on time? Almost over. But I would be happy to take questions and comments, if any that.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Let me say one more thing, if you don't. I think another task of Marxian economics is critique mainstream economics, and I hope you're, engaged in that too. A thorough, deep, comprehensive understanding from a critical point of view. And my own main targets have been marginal productivity theory, theory of distribution. That's the theory of profit, such as it is. And that's the main questions, right? So I've written several papers. Again, I'd be happy to send people. I think that should be the main target, the marginal productivity, Marxian critiques of neoclassical. And macro theory, first of all, macro theory has no theory of profit, period. Profit is not a variable in conventional mainstream. When I first discovered this when I was your age, I couldn't believe it. Macro intends to be a theory of capitalism without taking profit into account. How could that be? Right? And then there's the current DSGE models, or even more ridiculous, and based on the utility maximization of individuals and deriving the macro conclusions from those utility maximization. And the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework that's taught to students is also a favorite target of mine, which I would be happy to discuss later. But thanks very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Então, podemos começar agora a sessão de perguntas. Tá? Eu vou ter que me ausentar. Eu solicito aqui que, se houver alguma pergunta por vez traduzida, a gente pode dar uma força.
Ok.
Pessoal, como o Milão falou antes, pode fazer perguntas em inglês ou em português, aí a gente pediria aí para o senhor ajudar.
Well, I have a question about the crisis in 2008 in the US.
Yeah.
I just read the book by Michael Roberts, The Long Depression.
Long Depression, yeah.
And he says basically that that there's a long-run tendency of fall in the profit rate,
Right.
and the crisis comes from the problem in the real side. And I confess that I never understood very well the question of money, Marx. So what's your take on this? I mean, what's your interpretation about the crisis?
Okay, good question. I've written several shorter papers on that, which I'd be happy to share. I think Roberts. I don't agree with Roberts completely. I mean, I think the falling rate of profit is one important cause, but I think he's too monocausal, right? He just focuses on that, and I think his estimates, I mean, there have been a lot of estimates of the rate of profit, including by Otto here and others probably in the room, and there's, I mean, they all show a significant decline, right? Although some show a bit more of a recovery of the rate of profit since the early 80s, since in the neoliberal period, right? So, and I think I would argue that it certainly hasn't, by a long shot, has not recovered the prior decline, but there has been a little bit more of an increase than Roberts' estimates show. But the main thing, I think, is that he really does not emphasize enough the role of debt in the development of the crisis, and especially of household debt, home mortgages that played, I think, an important role. And my very quick version, my very quick explanation is that the causes of the crisis of 2008 go back to, have to be seen in a longer context, I argue, and really go back to the very significant decline in the rate of profit in the early post-war period, right, through the 70s and early 80s. By almost everybody's estimates, the rate of profit declined like 50%, right, during that period, right? And then what I would argue is that, capitalists, I mean, basically neoliberalism is about restoring the rate of profit. Right? That capitalists were well aware that the rate of profit had significantly declined, and were trying by every means possible to restore the rate of profit. And the main way was to suppress wages. Right? So you had then, a 20, 30-year period with little or no increases in real wages, right? As the result of the neoliberal attack on wages as a way to restore the rate of profit, right? And this was only partially successful, in terms of restoring the rate of profit, but it also caused another problem, which was a potential underconsumption problem, because wages had been suppressed for so long, right? That this then meant, you know, households, workers could not afford a new car or a house, right? And so what resulted was banks turning to workers as new customers, right? And increased lending to households, in part as a way to overcome this underconsumption crisis. Right? To enable them to continue to buy new cars and houses with borrowed money. Right? And this sort of sustained the economy through the 80s and 90s. But, debt cannot increase faster than income indefinitely. Right? And so this debt bubble burst, right? And turned out not to be sustainable, right? And that was then the crisis of 2008. And so I think, I don't know if that answered your question, but I mean, I think I would say the falling rate of profit is the deep fundamental primary cause, right? But this then led to further dynamics of attempts to restore the rate of profit, wage suppression, debt, bubble.
It's hard to disentangle all the effects.
It's hard to disentangle, although I think there is a somewhat of a chronological order, right? That the decline in the rate of profit came first, and then the attempts to restore the rate of profit, which involved primarily putting downward pressure on wages, right? Which required then more debt to sustain the economy, right? But that could not be maintained indefinitely. I don't know. What do you think?
I really don't know. I mean,
That's a U.S. economy. I guess maybe that's not a fair question.
That's not my focus. No, I think, I think you're right. It's basically about the neoliberalism and also the different structure of the economy. So things like financialization of non-financial firms, and also the global value chains. So they are trying, firms are trying to explore cheap labor in the global economy. So that's a constant pressure to lowering wages.
Yes.
Even as a threat to moving factories.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the ways, one of the main ways. I mean, globalization is basically a worldwide search for lower wages,
Yes.
right? In order to restore the rate of profit, right? I mean, globalization didn't just fall out of the sky. That was a response to a real problem. And it just so happens China was opening up their economy to foreign investment at about the same time. Right? I just spent 7 weeks in China this summer, so I got China on my mind. And I was struck by, I mean, their kind of beginning of reforms was in 1976. Right? And this was just about the time global capitalism was looking for low-wage labor around the world. So it was a kind of fortuitous coincidence. Yeah.
I have a question. Your view, what is now and would be an important topic for seeing the Marxian tradition for young students to go to study, to try to do something?
Okay, that's a good question. I think money in the 20th century, 21st century. I mean, Marx's theory in Capital, right, assumed commodity money, right, throughout. I mean, a few asides, but basically, I mean, systematically assumed commodity money, and and that made sense because money was commodity money, right? I mean, in a sense, at least, that paper money in circulation was convertible, right? Until, first on a national level in the 30s and an international level on the 70s, right? And so, but now, money is no longer convertible into gold at fixed exchange rates as under the gold standard, right? And so, in particular, what determines now the value of money, right? Given that, with commodity money, the determination of the value of money is easy, right? Or certainly easier, right? It's the value of gold, right? Precious metals, gold and silver, right? But now, money and the value of money, and therefore the price level, no longer has that anchor, right? That golden anchor. So what is it, right? And how is the value of money determined? And I myself come at this question kind of a little bit from the inverse. The inverse of the value of money is the money value produced per hour, right? The value of gold is the number of hours required to produce an ounce of gold, right? The inverse of that is the gold produced per hour, right? And under the gold standard, right, the money value produced per hour depended on the gold produced per hour, right? And this is what, this variable, the inverse of the value of money, is what Duncan calls the melt, right? The monetary expression of labor time, right? M-E-L-T, the melt, right? And this is a crucial variable in Marxist theory. The very kind of abstract theory would be price is equal to the melt times the number of labor hours, right? So this is, the melt is the money value produced per hour, right? So the unit per hour produced times the number of hours, right, gives you the money price, the money price representation of that quantity of labor time, right? So with commodity money, so this is a crucial, you don't have a labor theory of value without the melt, right? And so it's important to understand, what determines the melt, right? And with the value under the commodity money, that was easy, right? It's really 1 over L sub G, right? 1 over the amount of labor required to produce a unit, an ounce of gold, right? But now that we no longer have gold as the anchor, what determines the And I've written a couple papers on this, and I hope I'm on the right track, but I'm not even sure about that. And I think this is a very important question. What determines the value of money and the melt in today's modern inconvertible credit money monetary system, right? And just I'll say a little bit more about this. Marx kind of discussed a related subject in several places, where he wasn't talking about, like today's inconvertible credit money, but rather was talking about the government fiat money during the Napoleonic Wars, in particular as an episode, right? When, at least temporarily, the paper money forced into circulation by the government to pay for the war was no longer convertible into gold, right, at fixed exchange rate. And Marx argued in these few places that in that case, the belt depends on the quantity of money forced into circulation. Right? So, you know, it sounds a lot like a quantity theory of money, right? Which is really a quantity of money theory of price, right? Of the price level. And so, you know, in my first paper on this subject, I tried to follow up on that, right? And to discuss some of the implications of you know, in today's inconvertible credit money. If we were to follow Marx's hints, then it would seem like Marx's critique of the quantity of money becomes an acceptance, which he himself acknowledged in these few passages in the Grundrisse and Contribution. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or any ideas, but this is obviously not an easy, simple question. But it's, you know, in terms of the, you know, fundamental questions of Marx's labor theory of value, I would say that's the most important question. Then other than that, I would say, you know, just more analyses of crises. You know, in the U.S. and Brazil, you know, more empirical work on the rate of profit and related variables. I would like to see more attention to productive and unproductive labor. I mean, as you know, that it's possible to make a rough estimate of that distinction with the U.S. data, right? Because of the Bureau of Labor Statistics makes a similar distinction, right? But as I understand it, that's not possible in Brazil or in most other places in the world. So I don't know how to deal with it. Right? And I myself haven't really worked on that in a long time. But that, I think, would be another important, more empirical issue. The role of debt. The crisis, I think, like Roberts, I think too much of Marxian theory focuses only on the rate of profit. And I think a complete theory of crises also has to incorporate more the role of debt in generating the crisis. And, you know, and there's been some work along those lines, like trying to incorporate Minsky, right, or trying to combine Marx's falling rate of profit with Minsky's financial instability, right? But even there, I mean, Minsky's financial instability is only about the debt of firms, right? Minsky doesn't really talk about households. I mean, household debt, significant household debt, and as a significant cause of crisis is a relatively new phenomenon. Right? I mean, household debt in the U.S. Was almost non-existent before 1920. Right? It kind of really emerged with installment debt and so forth in the 1920s. But in 1929, the ratio of household debt to household disposable income was something like 30%. Still a relatively low number. In 2008, it was 130%. Right? So on a whole new level, right, which, like all debt, makes the economy unstable. potentially, raises another factor. So, I've been watching those debt indicators closely, and they kind of inch back up to where they were in 2008. But one thing is that interest rates are still very low. So even though the debt amounts are back close to 2008, the debt service ratio, the interest payments ratios, are less of a problem. Are lower. So I guess those are the things that come immediately to mind. Yeah, good.
Let me first thank you for your very interesting lecture. My question is about this last talk. You said being rigorous with Marx concepts. And what are the tricky questions when you deal, when you move from the wage share in the national accounts to this rate of labor exploitation? If you could talk a little bit more about this distinction between unproductive labor,
right, okay.
Or maybe about the top earners, which are incorporated into the wage shares and this kind of things.
Yeah, okay. Let me do a little simple algebra. I think the wage share, actually I'm going to simplify further and say just the ratio of profit to wages rather than profit to income. Okay, it's a similar sort of distinction, but it just makes the algebra simple. Okay, in fact, I'll do it both, but let me first do the profit to wages, right? Profit, we in English use pi, the Greek pi as often as a abbreviation for profit. You can't use P because P is price, right? So you need something else. Okay, so the numerator here, from taking into account this distinction, right, is the total surplus value produced by productive labor minus the wages of unproductive labor, right? The profit in the national income accounts, in the official government statistics, right, don't make this distinction. Their profit is just the net profit, right? But for Marx, you would need a prior estimate of the total surplus value, right? And then you subtract from that the wages of unproductive labor, right? And that gives you then the profit as capitalists recorded and counted, right? So that would be the numerator, right? And then wages, right, would be the sum of the wages of productive labor plus the wages of unproductive labor, right? And the wages of productive labor is also the Marxian concept of variable capital, right? So a variable capital plus the wages of unproductive labor, right? So this would be a way to start, and I'm going to do some more, but a way to start to convert the Marxian concepts into the profit to wage ratio. So surplus value, right, would be the new value or the value added minus the variable capital, right, and the variable capital only, right? This is where the new value and the surplus value comes from. It's productive labor, according to Marxist theory. So that difference between the new value produced by productive labor and the wages paid to productive labor is the surplus value produced by productive labor, right? So you have that, right? And you also have your estimates of the wages of productive labor and the wages of unproductive labor, right? And that then should equal, right, or does equal in Marxian terms, to the conventional, the mainstream ratio of profit to wages, right? Then another kind of analytical step to take is to divide all these variables on the right-hand side by the variable capital. Right? You know, like is typically done in studies of the rate of profit. Right? The Marxian rate of profit is just surplus value over constant capital. Right? And in order to analyze that, you often divide both of these by variable capital. So this is the rate of surplus value. This is the composition of capital. Right? So a similar kind of analytical step here would be to divide all these variables by variable capital. And the reason why you're dividing by variable capital is that's the source of surplus value. So all the other variables are being related to that ultimate source. Right? So that would give us then S over V divided by U over V over 1 V over V plus U over V. Right? So this says that the conventional profit to wage ratio depends on the rate of surplus value, right, and positively, you know, but also depends on the ratio, the relative proportions of unproductive labor and productive labor, and varies inversely. This ratio, right, varies inversely with U over V. So is that the kind of thing you had in mind? Or?
Yeah. I mean, because here in Brazil, I don't know, it's not so easy to see in the national accounts the wage of the unproductive labor. So
Right. So that's the challenge, and I don't know what because in the U.S. national accounts, you also don't have this distinction, right? But what you do have, fortunately, and it's an interesting kind of question, why you have this in a separate data source. See, this comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the national income accounts. In a separate bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? We call it the BLS, right? You also have data on what they call production workers and supervisory workers. And you have this broken down by industry, right? And so you have, one set, which we would call productive industries of manufacturing and services, but you also have wholesale and retail trade and finance, right? Which would be unproductive, right? So the BLS labor statistics, there's a lot of work to be done to kind of merge the two sets of the two sources, right? And it's really detailed and tedious and nitty gritty, and it takes a lot of work. But at least it's an approximation, right? At least it's a rough estimate based on this BLS distinction between production workers and supervisory workers and then the breakdown. So I don't know if anything like this exists in Brazil.
Well, we have a department from labor, but I believe it's not so micro detailed in comparison to the U.S. department.
Well, I think that would be a good PhD dissertation for somebody, even if in the end it's not satisfactory, right? At least give it a shot, I also did a little work on this in the 90s with a friend in Mexico, right? And they don't have as complete a set of data as the BLS in the U.S., but there's some pieces and you have to work harder and it's more heroic assumptions to even get rough approximations. But at least there's some fragments, there's some pieces that give you a rough idea. And really, to some extent, you don't have to be too precise. You know, as long as you get some idea about the overall trends. You know, it appears that this relative proportion of unproductive labor to productive labor, I mean, my hypothesis would be, has increased all over the world. Right? And it's not just the U.S. Although some would argue, and there's some I think truth to this, that part of what's happened with neoliberalism and in the post-war period, particularly in the last several decades, is that productive labor has moved to the rest of the world. Right? So you have, you know, the ratio of unproductive labor to productive labor is going up in the U.S., but that's because the productive labor is leaving the U.S., right? If you really take the world economy as a unit, which, you know, ultimately we should try, then perhaps the relative increase in unproductive labor is not as great. I mean, almost certainly is not as great as it appears in the U.S. Because what's happening is productive labor is being sent overseas. Right? So it shows up as a, you know, all the unproductive labor, the finance, right, is concentrated in the U.S., and the productive labor. So, I mean, that would also be an interesting sign. Right? The kind of international division of productive and unproductive labor. Yeah.
Okay. Some authors like Sheikh or Kleeman Roberts talk about
like who? Sheikh, I know.
Sheikh, Kleeman, and Howard. They talk about four features of capitalism after the 80s that contribute to the recovery, like the fall interest rate, the discrepancy in the wage growth and profit growth, the opening of new regions and sectors for the export of capital, and the appropriation of value from the sources of income and accumulated wealth through finance. Like, okay, all these features contributed to the recovery, but now they seem to me that they come to an end, or at least the expansion can continue in the same manner. So, how do you see the possibilities for a sustained recovery in the future?
Well, that's a really good question. I've actually been thinking about that in recent weeks, you know, it seems like that you know, that the rate of profit has recovered a little, you know, some compared to the worst in the early 80s. But only partially, right? And investment spending is still low and below normal levels. And of course, the rate of growth in the U.S. economy is 2% for ever since the recovery. And my kind of quick answer, or kind of tentative hypothesis at the moment, is that it doesn't seem like that a crisis is imminent, right, is soon. But I also don't see any faster growth. I don't see how the rate of profit can recover anymore, and it's too low to really generate more rapid investment and more rapid growth. Right? So, I mean, I think maybe the best prediction and forecast right now is just more of the same. You know, just kind of continued slow growth without a crisis. I mean, it doesn't seem like firms are on the verge of bankruptcy. It doesn't. It seems less so like households are, you know, in the same desperate circumstances they were in 2000. So I don't see maybe I'm being too optimistic. It would be the first time in my life. I agree. But I also don't see, more rapid growth in any kind of sustainable way. So I see the U.S. just kind of muddling along, as we say. And I think maybe what happens in the U.S. also depends on what's happening in the rest of the world. And again, I'm kind of obsessed with China right now, as are a lot of people. And maybe the real key factor in the world economy is what happens to China. Because China has become the so-called engine of growth. It has replaced the U.S. for sure as the engine of growth in the world economy. Certainly, I think for Latin America, for Africa, for the U.S. To some extent, and it's actually was asking about a research project. I would say China for a PhD dissertation. Because this is becoming and has become the most important economy in the world, I think, and it's something of a mystery, the Chinese economy, right? What is it really, right? And it's I would say it's clearly a capitalist economy, but it's a different kind of capitalist economy with much greater state control and with a nationalized banking system. The 4 largest banks in the world are Chinese, and they're all state-owned banks, right? And this gives China a new weapon, a kind of new possibility of managing crises. I say possibility. I'm not sure how successful in the long run this will be, but it's something new, and I think it's a very important subject for research, the Chinese financial system, and is it able, according to estimates, the rate of profit has fallen in China, and there are a lot of firms, especially the state-owned enterprises, that are losing money, right, and are defaulting on their loans, right? But unlike in the West, when an industrial firm is defaulting on their loans, the banks foreclose and sue for bankruptcy and shut the company down, right? In China, the state-owned bank is loaning to a state-owned enterprise in many cases, and so the bank does not force bankruptcy. The bank does not force payment, right? The bank allows them to continue to operate and fall further and further behind on their debt payments, and it's kind of a best kept secret. I don't know exactly how this is being managed internally to banks and the government, but something is going on there that is new, right? And that, at least so far has been able to manage crises. Chinese banks, as I understand it, had the kind of measure for financial trouble is the, quote, non-performing loan ratio. Non-performing loans means loans that aren't being paid off, right? So the debtors are behind. So that gets classified then as non-performing, right? I read where the Chinese banks had a non-performing loan ratio of 40% in the late 90s. 40% is unheard of in the West. 10% in the West is a crisis. 40% is unimaginable in the West. But somehow they got bailed out, right? They formed what we call in the West bad banks. Right? Sweden has done this, and other countries, where they kind of take all the bad loans, the non-performing loans, off of the regular banks and they kind of separate out, right? And all the non-performing loans go to this bad bank, right? And somehow the government keeps those bad banks afloat. And I'm just kind of coming to understand how important this is to try to understand better. But somehow they have lasted another 20 years without a crisis. After having a 40% non-performing loan ratio, right? I mean that's incredible, right? And now the good banks that are left, their non-performing loans are increasing again, right? Because after the 2008 crisis, right, China was worried about the world crisis affecting it, so it went on extreme expansionary fiscal policy, an infrastructure program, building bullet trains, new train stations. It's very impressive, actually, the Chinese infrastructure these days, but also loans and loans and loans to keep the industrial companies in business and afloat. And one of the explanations I read, and this may be kind of that the Chinese government is very afraid of a crisis, right? Because a crisis, they call themselves a socialist economy, right? And a crisis is not supposed to happen in a socialist economy. And a crisis is supposed to provide full employment, forever, And now, after 2008, unemployment is a threat, a danger. And in order to kind of reduce that threat, which they think really could cause instability, demonstrations, uprisings, strikes, they embarked on this debt explosion and very expansionary fiscal policy in order to avoid the crisis. But now they have a debt ratio which is the highest in the world. Right? So, they managed somehow to avoid a crisis with the debt problem in the late 90s, with the world crisis of 2008, and now they've got another bubble on their hands. I think this is the most important question in the world economy. Is China going to be able to manage this or not? Because it has, significant implications not only for China, but for the rest of us. I don't know how much Brazil soybeans goes to China, but probably a lot. And U.S. soybeans too. China's the engine. But if it's a capitalist economy, but it's a different kind of capitalist economy. I mean, it's a capitalist economy from the point of view of workers. I would say, workers are wage laborers. The factory conditions in China are no better, if not worse, than the U.S. Workers have fewer rights than in many countries in the world. So, from the point of view of workers, especially, the China boom, the low-wage workers that, had come mainly from the countryside, migrant workers coming in with almost no rights, right? They have to live in the cities, but they don't have the registration card for the cities, so they don't get social services. Their children can't go to public schools, so they have to leave the children behind in the countryside, and the grandparents take care of the children. You know, it is really a dark underside of the China boom, right? But they so far have been able to maintain, right, and avoid a deep crisis. And so that's becoming a preoccupation of mine. Trying to figure out just what is the nature of this economy, and is it a form of capitalism with a nationalized banking system and tight control of the government? I mean, they have privatized and they have decentralized, but the government still controls that economy. The CP still is almost complete control. So does that solve the crisis problem of capitalism or not?
Yeah, because if China runs out of surplus labor, then capital will need to spread to other areas.
Which is happening already.
Yeah,
actually.
South Asia maybe.
Yeah, Vietnam, Bangladesh,
East Africa, Kenya, Uganda.
Okay, yeah. You know, the other thing about China is, you know, this centralized control. They really have a global vision, right? And really of Chinese domination, you know, at least in Asia, if not the world, right? And, you know, meanwhile, the U.S. is, you know, groveling in the mud. They have a clear vision and consistent, right? And they're executing it very well. You know, trade relations with, you know, building infrastructure in Africa, buying resources in Latin America, right? I mean, they've got a 100-year vision, and they're really. I mean, in our hotel, you know, the hotel provides breakfast, and so we were having breakfast, and we happened to sit down one morning by a bunch of people from Kenya, right? They were there at this hotel, you know, a kind of luxury deluxe hotel, at a conference sponsored by the Chinese on sustainable energy, right, and plus trade relations, I think in general, right? And so they were there for a week, and then the Chinese government paid for them to take a 2-week tour around China, right? To go to Nanjing and Shanghai, you know, visit the tourist sites. I mean, they are cultivating relationships like that, and they have the money. They have the money. The universities have the money. They offered me a 3-year job. I was just there. I was just barely there. I don't know, you want to come work? You know, and the other weird thing is Marxism is emphasized. You know, it's still their ideology. This is another very interesting, very interesting aspect of the Chinese economy, you know, which is based on the super exploitation of these migrant workers, right? And yet they are expanding studies, Marxist studies departments in all the universities. It's usually not economics, you know, I don't know what it is. But I was even told, and I haven't been able to confirm this, that Premier Xi has a PhD in Marxian studies. Does anybody know anything about that? And they are dishing out lots of money to all universities to expand their departments of Marxist studies, right? One woman told me, she teaches in the agricultural university in China, and the government kind of oversight committee visited their university last year. She called it the censorship committee. I don't know if that's the right translation or not, but it's the function, I guess. Anyway, maybe it's accurate. They call it that, or at least that's the way she translated whatever the Chinese word is. The censorship committee did a review of their university, and their main recommendation was more Marxist studies.
It's weird.
It's very weird. And so, I mean, and they still, socialism with Chinese characteristics, right, is what they call themselves. And they obviously are really still pushing this Marxism as their official ideology and pouring resources. So that's another fascinating, unprecedented, incredible. China is just full of mysteries. Shall we end on that note? Yes. Might as well. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
That's great. Amazing. Still,
No.
my master thesis, I don't know if you call it that, here
Yeah.
we call it dissertation, but my master thesis was about summarizing, trying to systematize Marx's theory on money and
That's good.
financial theory on capital. From the first book to the third, and I believe that part 5 has so many things that wasn't yet fully studied and fully thought.
Yes.
And I found there some sort of theory, not sort because it's really, really clear to see it taking some parts of the text, cycle, industrial cycles, as they call it. Related to credit and crisis. There are steps from stagnation to growth, and then speculation and overproduction related to credit. And the credit system explains banking credit, commercial credit, and I believe there are tips to solve many problems, many contemporary problems, like the relation to money values that we have already discussed, and the evolution of financial systems. And I'm thinking about taking a PhD in the USA. Do you know somewhere where I could go? Someone who could?
Probably UMass.
You know?
And it's not great.